This is topic 9, the final topic in our unit, Foundations for Education. In this topic, we're going to be covering 3 concepts. The first, revisiting the concept of education. Then we're going to talk about becoming critically reflective educators. And finally, we'll conclude the unit by pulling it all together. In this unit, we've adopted a particular definition of education, and it's from a critical perspective. Education, properly speaking, according to this theory and definition, is a process by which children, young people and adults are initiated into forms of understanding, modes of action and ways of relating to one another and the world that foster individual and collective self-expression, self-development, and that are in these senses orientated towards the good for each person and the good for mankind. Now that last sentence, good for each person and good for mankind, is a real insight into the critical nature of that definition. It's quite different to the first definition that we looked at in topic 1, which was quite a standard definition from a dictionary. So, as we've discovered in this unit, education has 3 interests or aims. And this is a really key concept for you to be thinking about as we conclude this unit. So there are technical interests and aims where education is a means to an end or a product, and these are guided, these interests and aims are guided by generic outcomes. There are practical interests and aims where education is seen as a complex of practices, a process, guided by situated responses about the proper thing to do in particular sites and settings. So not generic, but situated. The third, a critical interest and aims, is where education is seen as a social activity, a political, historical, and most importantly, a contested act. It critiques the status quo and is guided by contemplations of the way things are and why things are the way they are. It's very obvious in our media and popular newspapers and popular media that technical interests and practical interests and aims are quite at the forefront of the way people think about and understand education. There's less evidence of the critical interests and aims, which is what we've been really trying to promote in this unit, to bring to the front of your mind as you start your education degree. So, in the text, chemists and Edward Groves tell us that studying education, we need to understand, in order to study education well, we need to understand how schools and schooling have evolved and how we understand, and to understand how we, in our time, might improve the educational value of our own teaching. To do this, they say we've got to have several things in place, or to be thinking about several things. We have to have some understanding of what we're doing now, of how what we're doing now is informed and justified by theories and traditions of education. We should have some understanding of our own and others' educational values, some knowledge of the way our educational work fits in the wider context of schooling and society, and some historical understandings of schools and schooling and where they've come from. And I hope that you can see that that is what we've tried to achieve in this unit. So in terms of educational traditions, we've looked quite closely at those across millennia and also within the Australian context. These traditions have been formed, reformed, and will continue to be transformed. They are not static things. So it's with interest, I think, for you to reflect on those formations of educational traditions, whether or not they reflect critical interests and aims, practical interests and aims, or technical interests and aims. Some of the most ancient Aristotle's work is perhaps more critical than some of the more contemporary reformations of education, which might actually be reflecting more technical interests and aims. Educational theories, again, we've done quite a bit of work on this. We've looked at paradigms and particular theorists. And these have varying degrees of evidence in terms of the kinds of interests and aims that they are set out to achieve and how they influence our understandings of education. And again, these have been formed, reformed, and will continue to be transformed across millennia. In this unit, we've presented quite, I guess, one of a newer formation in terms of a particular critical theory that is changing the way we think about education in a whole range of contexts. And I hope Anne Graham's lectures, presentations showed you some really clear evidence of that happening. To think about how educational values and aspirations are formed and where they come from, we looked quite closely at the Melbourne Declaration. One document that we haven't looked at in any detail, but I did want to bring to your attention, is this OECD document called The Future of Education and Skills, Education 2030. I've listed it in the additional readings list. It's a really interesting document to sit alongside the Melbourne Declaration and to see, one is of the past, a decade past, and one is of 2 more decades, or the decade to come. So again, look at those, read those, see what interests and aims you can read between the lines, or sometimes it's quite overt. One of the really interesting aspects for me is the tendency in most of these documents to talk about children and young people reaching their full potential. I think that's actually quite interesting in terms of just viewing what that term might mean through those different lenses. I'll leave that work for you to do and think about. In the Australian context, and particularly the contemporary context, we do gauge the educational values and aspirations. These general capabilities in the Australian curriculum came from Goal 2 in the Melbourne Declaration, and they're reflected in both the Early Years Learning Framework and the Australian curriculum. Again, you can read those capabilities and you can see across them they reflect all 3 of those interests and aims. Looking at education and schooling, the authors of our text have made it very clear that they perceive a clear tension between education and schooling. As a discipline and as a profession, at its heart there is a fundamental tension between education and schooling. And they go on to talk about what they mean about this, by that. So schools are intended to protect and nurture the pursuit of the practice and the practice of education. So schools as institutions have a particular role in education. However, the authors, Kemmis and Edward Groves, say schooling is quite a different thing. Schooling is what's done in a variety of institutions created by societies, ostensibly to educate children and young people, but which sometimes perform in ways that are non-educational and even anti-educational. We've used lots of examples within in the unit, but one that you could think of in terms of a practice in schools, a schooling practice that is no longer acceptable, that has been ruled unacceptable, non-educational, in fact anti-educational, is the use of corporal punishment. Once common practice and quite expected and regulated. So to improve the educational value of our teaching, which is what we're trying to do here as novice teachers, we need to adopt a critical and self-critical approach to the study of education to reveal how current forms of schooling are non-educational or anti-educational, and to create changes necessary to reform schooling to make it more educational. So you might remember early in the unit we talked about an article that Nan Barr and Joe Ferrara wrote that was really highlighting some of the non-educational or anti-educational experiences teachers were talking about as reasons why they no longer wanted to stay in the profession. There are still non-educational and anti-educational practices in contemporary schooling contexts. Your immersion experience hopefully has given you a really rich and fresh view or vision of education practices. If you haven't already done so, it would be really worthwhile looking at your immersion experience through those three lenses to see if you can identify those interests and aims at play. I'm not saying that one is better than the other because we're taking a critical theoretical approach. This is a both and. Education has to have technical interests and aims. It should have practical interests and aims, and it should have critical interests and aims. All three are important. So, educational transformations. I thought this was a really interesting quote to pull out of the readings in terms of thinking about whether or not education shapes or whether it mirrors society. In here, in this quote or this section of the reading, the authors are talking about the fact that it does both. It has elements of reproduction to maintain understanding, skills and values from the past. Past is important, but it also has elements of transformation to stimulate change towards the new kinds of understanding, skills and values required. And again, that OECD 2030 document is a really interesting source of thinking about what kinds of transformations might be ahead for you as an educator in the next decade. Coming up next, we're going to talk about harnessing those lenses, particularly the critical lens, to become a critically reflective educator.